Everything began with a late-night phone call, a voice gone hoarse and spare like a verdict, slicing through a half-finished breath in a day that had seemed calm. Words fell like stones, clacking against one another until they formed a chain of events that could not be reversed. Accident, fire, identification, funeral. In that instant, Vanessa's world shrank into a thin, dark fissure running straight through everything she had once believed was solid. The room seemed to contract, the air went heavy, and all else receded, leaving only a cold fact pressed against her skin. Doug was dead, or at least a declaration of death had been drowned in smoke and procedure. The shock did not erupt into a scream. It slid into her chest, threaded through her shoulders, tightened around a wrist searching for something to hold. There was nothing to grasp except an immediate, non-negotiable decision. Return to Fairmont Crest and fulfill the duty of the one left behind. The day Vanessa set foot on the estate, the sky wore a quiet purple as if a morning veil had been draped over the town. Bad news traveled in its own way, silent, wide, inevitable. Messages, polite embraces, and lingering looks wove a web around her, and Vanessa stood at the center of it, knowing she had become the focal point of a story everyone believed had ended even as it had only just begun. Her and Doug's son appeared without a word, his suitcase carving a short, hard line across the stone floor, a hyphen between a scrambled present and a past once neatly shelved. His eyes darkened, no noisy tears, only an unnamed hollow. Vanessa's hand fell to his shoulder in a reflex that was part comfort, part self-steadying, while the other hand gripped her phone as if the small device could still leak a fragment of information capable of turning the board upside down. Guilt arrived before any paperwork. It blew in like cold wind. The man had gone after a long season of fractures, resentments, broken sentences, half-formed accusations. The living are rarely forgiven for what they never finished. She went to the cold room for identification. Everything there ran on rules and forms, on timestamps and signatures, as if grief were a transaction that could be reconciled. What remained of Doug had been stripped by the fire into an unrecognizable shape, the familiar features blurred into shadow. Vanessa knew she could not be certain, knew that at such a boundary memory and loyalty could sketch certainty into being. Yet her confusion was crushed by the weight of remorse. She signed not out of absolute trust, but because she could not bear herself if she prolonged the minutes on the line between doubt and duty. The stamp of torment turned that decision into a lead medallion hanging at her throat, every breath tugging the cord tighter. Fairmont Crest quickly converted its palette to black, white, and purple. The church wore a fresh silk sheen on its walls. Candles were arranged to a full glow, bouquets chosen by hands that knew exactly what beauty must serve. At the center, an urn and an oversized portrait stood like a milestone, a curated proclamation of an ending polished to an artifact. Vanessa's attire fit like a costume tailored for the greatest role of her life, the perfect widow. She clenched her hand until her nails pricked the soft of her palm, slender red scratches like inked lines signing a pact of silence. Joey stood beside her with just enough calm. When he spoke, his voice was as smooth as water that has never met a storm. In that moment, composure became a detail that refused to dissolve, a grain of sand lodged in the fold of suspicion. Donnell stepped up with a eulogy that was short and dim, words pressed flat and dry, as if grief were afraid to step into the light lest it shatter into pieces too small to gather. The living were performing a ritual to wrap the dead, but each of them was also staging a private rite to bind themselves. When the crowd dispersed, the church exhaled a soft breath. Small sounds returned, the patient metronome of heels on stone. Donnell lingered, eyes drifting across the candle stands until they halted on a single white camellia. Not the usual flower for funerals. It sat there like a message tucked between cloth and metal. Clipped beneath its stem was a small folded receipt from a mobile medical service in the suburbs of Prince George's. time-stamped to match the moment of the announced accident. Below, in a fine hand, a line negating loss and a time mark. Nothing screamed drama. It only shifted the map a fraction, cracking the old connections, opening paths for new hypotheses. Donnell stood still, as if a door had opened behind him without any wind. He pocketed the slip as one might keep a clandestine relic, saving it for the moment he would face the only person with the standing to decide what came next. Vanessa did not react with a gasp, but with the quick change of color along her lash line. She had played the part to perfection all day. Each gesture, step, and nod had been stitched with an invisible needle. But as the puzzle pieces began to show hairline fractures, the costume tightened and air thinned. She had pushed herself into the role of perfect widow to avoid the most terrifying question. If death was stagecraft, who was the hidden player at the strings? Reasoning demanded she brush the edge of the name she least wanted to confront. The man she had allowed into the softest region of her life, Joey. His overabundant calm, the way he conducted logistics, the almost machine tempo of events before, during, and after the service, everything nested too neatly to be random. Yet Vanessa also knew that perfection can be the way the world arranges itself when too many people want to believe in order. She stood between two mirrors facing each other. Remain silent and let the ritual close like a contract, or pivot, scuff the polished floor, and open the door to the basement of truth. Silence meant complicity, at least with the helplessness inside her, and also meant preserving everything dangling by the thread of a family's honor. But if the truth forced her to face Joey as the architect, then silence would be burying a living part of herself beside warm evidence. To speak up would be to immolate the image she had just built, burning the slender bridge that linked her to a child who needed a steady foothold. To call her son back to school and pull him from the storm or keep him nearby as a moral witness to looming choices. That, too, carved another notch in the map of torment. Joey sensed a change without words, in the way his lips pressed a heartbeat longer when he, like Vanessa, received an anonymous letter. 2 identical envelopes, 2 printed name lines like reflections. Both faces flickered at the sight of a handwriting they both recognized. The same message in other phrasing. A reassurance that loss was only a curtain, a timestamp like an appointment. No longer ownerless rumor, it was a summons to unlock memory. Joey lifted a glass of water as a ritual to keep his hand from trembling. Vanessa set the letter beside Doug's portrait as if to compare 2 versions of one man. A frozen gaze and a thin line of script still breathing. The moment did not judge guilt or innocence. It only certified that the game had begun. Elsewhere, Donnell laid the receipt and the camellia on a table and sketched scenarios like a chessboard without a queen. If Doug was alive, what motive could be heavy enough to force him into flame and absence, abandoning wife, child, and a community of watchful eyes? If it wasn't self-designed protection from a larger threat, then whose hand had pushed, which brake had been loosened, what network demanded a symbolic death to hide a deeper lattice? Young enough to still want transparency, Donnell was compelled to grow by shrinking the distance between hypothesis and action. He knew he could not naively hand everything to the police when the clues slid off the template of ordinary investigation. He needed his mother clear-edged, yet she was being forced to be gentle in her award-winning widow's role. That contradiction had been written into the script from the start. The funeral closed nothing. Fairmont Crest, with its high walls and hedges trimmed like discreet marginalia, kept its silence. Vanessa began to rewind the timeline, calls, receipts, the odd blinks of staff and security. She met a soft wall of mechanical politeness, but she knew a slit no wider than a fingernail could let suspicion through. Doug's appointments in the days leading to the accident formed an odd coordination. Non-overlapping meetings, routes passing industrial districts where that mobile medical unit had been seen. A tired gas station camera caught a figure with a familiar build at the edge of the frame, insufficient for certainty but enough to expand the map. Each discovery resembled a rung on a ladder, except the ladder did not climb up. It descended into the sublevels where unwritten agreements were stored. Joey became the largest question precisely because of his flawlessness. A man truly stranded in the role of the one left behind would reveal fissures of fear, and yet Joey held his structure with unnerving precision. Business ties he had lately formed threaded oddly into private medical funds, money moving through corporate shells. Vanessa noted without concluding, aware of how dangerous it is to move too fast. She began small tests, altering plans without warning, tossing pebbles sizable enough to ripple his schedule. She spoke through gestures and silence, studying which reactions were reflex and which were theater. The child stood between two conflicting commands: leave and return to school as a way to salvage a life singed by fire, or stay as a sentinel for the debt owed to truth. Vanessa saw that she was thrusting him into an orbit of adulthood forged from sharp metal. She measured the drop of each decision, knowing that keeping him close should not be for the comfort of an ally but to show him how a grown person takes responsibility for her own suspicion. Even the slightest hesitation could be a gap wide enough for someone else to slip through and lay another layer of deceit over the story. The tug-of-war turned each night into a long watch, when every object in the house had a shadow and every shadow could hold intent. Once both Vanessa and Joey held anonymous letters, the smooth surface of ritual officially cracked. No accusations were needed. The chilling synchronicity of timing and message sufficed. The letters questioned not only the death but each person's role in the performance of remembrance. Vanessa understood that from here on, any move would fall under the microscope of forces angling to control the outcome. She would have to proceed like a tightrope walker, beneath her the pit of family honor, above her the blade of truth. She knew anger, left unguided, can turn inward and cut the one who carries it. So she chose to shape it into discipline, breaking fear link by link, reconciling minutes and movements until the picture revealed a structure that could be trusted. On the last night before she stepped into a new chapter, Vanessa stood before the portrait and looked long into its frozen eyes. If Doug lived, that image was a mask for a man hiding from a concealed blade. If he was gone, then the fine-line script was a trick meant to lead the living away from justice. Both possibilities demanded strength, but each carried a different sentence for the heart. She knew she no longer owned the luxury of standing between. At dawn, calls would follow a new route. A few names would be dragged into the light. A few doors would be opened with keys not asked for. The camellia would be kept as the point of origin for an alternate map, and the receipt would be the invitation to a rendezvous at 2315 in a place with no candles and no hymns. Fairmont Crest would no longer be a pageantry of black, white, and purple alone. Grays would emerge. The whir of machines and the sting of disinfectant would wedge between polite whispers. Joey would have to choose between maintaining his unbroken calm or slipping, just once, enough to expose a seam. Donnell would cease to be the young man standing at the margins of adult decisions and become the keeper of the first evidence capable of flipping the narrative. And Vanessa, weighted first by mourning, had been forged by fury into the one rewriting the script. If truth finally delivered her to Joey behind the curtain, she would not scream or smash. She would lay each piece on the table and walk him through them like a corridor of mirrors where every step reflected 1,000 versions of himself. And if truth opened another exit, where Doug stood in flesh with an explanation of a greater threat, then the fight would no longer be a family's private matter, but a counteroffensive against a system that runs on staged funerals and letters sharp as blades. In both scenarios, silence had ceased to be an option. Only action remained, and the price that comes with it. Thank you for taking the time to watch my video. All the content I make is just speculation and personal sharing. If you find the video interesting and useful, please support me with a like and leave a comment. If you have better ideas or more interesting speculations, please share them in the comments section for everyone to discuss. I appreciate all your contributions and support. Sincerely, thank you.